who is and who is to come. Amen. In the year 2000, I was asked by a friend of mine to accompany him and a group that was going to Israel. It was my one and only trip to the Holy Land. I was going to go and have half of my way paid because I was going to be an assistant. I would drive one of the vans and I would help schlep the bags. And that second part was the purpose of this story today. You see, in Jerusalem, especially in the old city, there's all these cobblestones and all these stairs. And so even though people were told they should pack a bag, and those of you who've traveled with me know my penchant for traveling light, one person had brought this giant bag full of stuff, and she was older and couldn't really move it, so that bag became my best friend for the trip. And so we're hauling it around, and I hauled it up and down. She lives on this third floor apartment that we were staying, and when we finally, on the last night that we were there, we were talking about, getting ready to leave the next day to come back. And she opened her suitcase there and she says, "I just don't know what to do with all these cans of tuna fish." And I was like, say what? Say what? She says, yeah. See, when I came here, I didn't know if I'd be able to eat any of the food, so I brought a can of tuna fish for every day we're going to be here. And now I've got 14 cans of tuna fish to give away. I had very unchristian thoughts about that woman. I thought about the damage that was being done to my back by hauling her 14 cans of tuna all over God's holy land. But I also then, it gave me food for thought. Whenever we do a pilgrimage, and by the way, pilgrimages are wonderful things. The difference between being a pilgrim and a tourist is that when a pilgrim goes someplace, a pilgrim expects to come back transformed, to be changed by the experience. And so you can do this on your own or with a group. We just had a group about a year or so ago go to Italy, and next year, you'll see information coming out, we're going to have a trip to Ireland to study Celtic spirituality. So that's coming up. But when we have those trips, I always have one class just dedicated to packing in memory of this woman and her 14 cans of tuna. And I always talk about how traveling light is such a relief. The worst thing for me is to pack something and then get back and know that I never needed it. To have gotten something in my bag that I schlepped around the world and then I get back and I never actually needed it. I think that Jesus is sending out his disciples 2 by 2 with this lesson in traveling light. And it's more than just the stuff. It's about traveling light on so many levels. First of all, 2 by 2. The importance of this, I think, is that gospel isn't done as a solo act, that we're supposed to do this in community. Even the Trinitarian theology that we ascribe to says that God's self is in community, and that everything that is done in relationship. And so we're sent out not as lone rangers, but instead as a team to be able to witness to God's love. And when we get there, imagine this for the instructions. You're going to go out into dangerous places. He describes it as you'll be sheep among wolves. And so, if I'm going to be sheep among wolves, I'm gearing up, right? I'm going to drop by my local REI and make sure I am set to go. Instead, he says, take no bag, no purse, no sandals. In fact, just go right now. Just take off. What if I were to say to you, I've got a mission for us as a community. I want us to leave right now and to take off into all sorts of places around the world, places in which there is struggle and strife, places that are dangerous. But I don't want you to bring your iPhone, and I don't want you to bring your credit cards, and I don't want you to bring any cash. I want you just to go. Sermon over, go. Yeah, I would stay put too, right? You see, it's hard to travel that light, but it's so important for us. Why? 2 reasons. 1, Jesus intends for his disciples to practice what I call Blanche Dubois evangelism, to always depend on the kindness of strangers, to get to a place and to be not as the answer person, not as the resource person, but in need. See what happens? You show up at a town and you say, I need a place to stay. I have nothing to eat. It gives the other person the chance to do a loving act, to be hospitable, to welcome them in. That's why he says, you go and you say, peace to this house. And if they say peace back, you have a relationship. Something has happened. You give them the opportunity. When I was at Central City Lutheran Mission in San Bernardino, all these different churches would come on Sunday evenings and they would provide a meal after our worship service for our homeless men and women who were coming as part of our community. And a group of guys who stayed there said to me, Pastor, is it possible for us to put on a meal for all of them? You see, every Sunday they come and they bring a great meal, but we want to say thank you and to provide a meal for them. So we want to do the meal, but we want you to pay for it, Pastor. But we don't want you to shop for it. We don't want you to help. We just want you to do it. So I said, that's a great idea. Let's do it. So I gave them the money. They went out and bought the stuff. They put together this barbecue. And I invited all these churches to come. Just come and just sit. And I got to tell you, it was awkward and uncomfortable watching all these Lutherans not get in the kitchen. Every single one of them would look around and they'd be like, oh, I could probably help with that. Oh, I can. It's like, just sit down. Just receive. They want to do something for you. And it's so hard. If I asked almost anyone here, hey, you know what, one of our people's in need, would you mind going to the hospital and bringing them something? Yes, absolutely. But you know how many of you go to the hospital and don't tell us? Because you don't want to be a bother. And I get it. But that's something that's ingrained in us. We don't want to be in need. But the whole process of being in need is being vulnerable. You hear what Jesus is saying? Go into the world and be vulnerable. Don't bring your backpack. Don't bring all of your resource. Instead, be in a place where you can have mutual exchange. The stuff gets in the way. That's reason number 2. Stuff allows us to hide and to not have this encounter with God, to not really have to radically trust that God will take care of it. I don't have everything and I don't know everything, even when I think I do. This is what this reminds me of. One-way evangelism is never really good news. It's not good news if I have all the resource and you have all the need. If the only way that this goes is that people on a regular basis come and we provide and they take. That's not, ultimately what that does is it establishes a status quo between the haves and the have-nots, whether that's economic or whether that's theological or educational. Instead, the action of the church is meant to be an exchange. We say at the beginning of the service, I said, our service is more complete when new people are here. I believe that theologically. I really do. I don't know everything that there is to know about God. Trust me on that one. And I will learn more by the more diverse that we are as a community. When people who come here, who come from different countries and cultures, our country is made great by the input of immigrants in indigenous communities. The more we have to learn from each other, the greater our understanding is of God and of who we are in God's universe. And so, evangelism that is, I have a truth, you have no truth, is not good news for either. But evangelism that says, I have a relationship with God that is exciting to me about this God of forgiveness and hope and meaning and love, and I want to know about your life. And I want to have that be, I'm willing to be different as a result of this dialogue. You see, ultimately, that's the kind of encounter that can change the world, that can make us more connected. We oftentimes find that our security is in our stuff, even when our stuff is our intellectual stuff or our theological stuff. But it's not. Our security is not in our 401k nor in our Lutheran theology. Our security is in God, where it should be. A God who loves us and cares for us, who ultimately shakes God's head when we do silly things, but ultimately welcomes us all home. Our stuff can prevent us from seeing and experiencing God's love. One of the great challenges, I think, before this congregation is to make a generational shift. It's a huge one. This congregation was founded in 1947 by a builder pastor with a builder generation. And what did the builder generation do? All those people who came back from World War II, who defeated fascism and were reestablishing the power of this country, they built. They bought and they built. They demonstrated their faithfulness to God in this place by expanding the footprint of this campus and the meaning of this theology in this town. That's what happened for generations. We saw from 1947 to 1979, buy and build was the modus operandi of Christ Lutheran Church. I talked to Quentin Garman, by the way, and he said the secret to success in the church is you put them in a building project every year. Did you know that he thought that way? Right? And that he's yes, Josie, you were aware that that is exactly how he thought. But guess what? The world has shifted since 1947, and again since 1967, and again since 1979. In fact, what we've seen since 67 is the landscape of religious life in America has radically shifted and still shifts. All denominations are in some form of decline. We've seen a rise of people who identify on any sort of survey as none of the above when asked about religious preference. And there's a new group that's rising that's people who have been involved in church and they are deeply committed to God, but now they're kind of done with the institution. We have a generation of people who were raised in their childhood with no religious training because we wanted to let them decide for themselves. But they had to decide now from nothing as opposed to from something. And we have a cycle of people throughout the generations that maybe they would leave in their college years, but then they would come back once they had children. And this is the first time when the sociologists are documenting that people aren't coming back when they have kids. All of this changing landscape, there's still a hunger for spiritual wholeness. There's still a need for deep identity and to know what it is that we're about, for purpose and for meaning and for hope, for spiritual practices that can transform. I would just note how many churches have closed and how many yoga studios have opened. And by the way, I'm a practitioner of yoga. I'm a big fan. But what I want to say is it's giving a practice, and somehow it's responding to something in our culture that we may have missed and need to reclaim. If the 1950s ever came rushing back into our culture, we would be ready. But God has placed us here in 2016, in this place, in Pacific Beach, to share this same good news of God's unconditional love with these neighbors. And God doesn't make mistakes with God's mission. We are exactly the people that we've been waiting for. We are exactly in the place that God has placed us for a reason. We've been reimagining and repurposing our campus, and the big transition for us is, can we switch from being a builder generation congregation to being a congregation for millennials and post-millennials? If we do, we may be the first congregation that actually has pulled it off. And it will take rethinking and holding loosely on everything. It will mean traveling light. It will mean traveling into the future without all of our securities and being willing to risk it all for the sake of the one who loves us. We've been looking at our facilities. We've re-landscaped the front thanks to all the help of the students from Arizona. We've been able to, we'll save water and give a witness to caring for creation. We're right in the middle of funding a project to redo the lounge so that it would be better for fellowship for not just our church members, but for our community, that they would want to use that space for receptions and for meetings. We're trying to figure out how we can leverage that on a wider basis. We have teams looking at Garment Hall and God's Garage and Luther View Apartments, all trying to figure out what is it that God's calling us to do with all these great resources that we received from this builder generation, but that the postmillennial generation may not be interested in continuing. What is it that we're called to do at this time and in this place? All these projects are important, and handling them well will require tough work. But personally, I want to get them done as soon as possible so we can get on to the more pressing call of sharing God's good news. You see, at the end of the day, we are the bearers of a treasure that was meant to be given away. We who have known God's grace are to share it with people who live in what they perceive to be a cold and meaningless universe. And we are to welcome them fully, including their ideas and their questions and their practices, and to let them join in our work. It will mean that we will need to let go of being right for the sake of being in relationship. It will mean shedding our stuff so that we can trust God for daily provision. Amen. Our song of response is, Lord, you give the Great Commission.